Good morning. I will pre-warn you, today you will hear language that we find repulsive. I'm not going to cut it out because it makes us quiver. We'll get started. On June 12, 1864, after failing to defeat Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, accompanying Major General George G. Meade's Army of the Potomac and a portion of the Army of the James, pulled away from the fortifications at Cold Harbor and began the movement toward Petersburg. Some troops ferried to the Bermuda Hundred region just north of Petersburg to begin the attack on the city the following day, June 15th. Petersburg in 1860 had been Virginia's second largest city. Population 18,266 folks. Since the War of 1812, it had been referred to as the Cockade City because volunteers wore cockades on their hats as they went off to war. 4 railroads radiated from the city by 1860. The Petersburg Railroad, which ran south to Weldon, North Carolina. The Richmond and Petersburg, obviously connecting those two places. The South Side, which ran from City Point, modern-day Hopewell, Virginia, through Petersburg to Lynchburg, and the Norfolk and Petersburg. In addition to Petersburg's railroads, the city possessed 4 cotton factories, 3 flour mills, 4 iron foundries, and 3 planing mills. These operations, tap into a discussion that we were just having about the importance of places, are going to be cranking out supplies and food for the Confederacy throughout the war. In addition to that industrial activity, the Confederacy operated several wartime plants within or near the city, still functioning in the summer of 1864, including a naval rope works, a lead works, with artificial niter beds to obtain saltpeter for the gunpowder, and a wagon works. The wartime blockade, getting back to the interest in the blockade, had created even greater importance for the Petersburg Railroad because at Weldon, a separate railroad company, the Weldon and Wilmington, operated connecting Petersburg with European ran goods through the blockade there at Wilmington. Grant wanted, I should have clicked a while ago, there's Petersburg. Grant wanted to cut off Richmond's communications and transportation of goods from and through Petersburg, and of course destroy Lee's army. From June 15th to the 18th, before Lee even really fully arrived at Petersburg, Union troops assaulted the city but failed to capture it. Siege operations began, and along one part of the line, the men in Major General Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps were less than 400 feet from the Confederate earthworks. In the midst of the summer of 1864's drought and heat wave was the constant sharpshooting, construction of earthworks, and a plan had developed to break this campaign before it lasted much longer. As early as June 21st, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasants of the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry thought mining the Confederate position at Elliott's Salient, alternately called Pegram's Battery, was a possibility. He later noted greatest enthusiasm for the project was his division commander, Brigadier General Robert Potter, and his corps commander, Ambrose Burnside. The 48th Pennsylvania Infantry began excavating the mine on the 25th of June. For whatever reason, people remembered it started at 12 o'clock noon. So if you are a detailed-oriented person, they left it for us. The work was performed night and day, 7 days a week, even in the intense summer heat, which often exceeded 105 degrees. The concerns about ventilating the mine were addressed, kind of represented in the images here. Fresh air entered an 8-inch square wooden duct, circulated through, creating, and fire was created, which would send the bad air out through a chimney shaft. Canvas door was placed over the entrance to keep fresh air in and allow miners to get in and out of the shaft. As the laborers extended the mine, so too would the wooden duct system be extended, and by the 17th of July, the mine will reach the 510.8 feet that Pleasants had first proposed. 2 galleries are going to be extended, which is represented in this image at the top, underneath the Confederate position in which the gunpowder is supposed to be packed. While the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry dug the mine, Ambrose Burnside crafted a battle plan. 3 weeks ahead of the assault, he informed Edward Ferrero, you see there, commanding Division of U.S. Colored Troops, of his plan to use those men first. Burnside expected 12,000 pounds of gunpowder to explode somewhere around daybreak, or at least by 5 a.m. Then the black soldiers would be massed in double columns, all ready to pass through the gap in the enemy's line. The lead regiment of the brigade was to be perpendicular to the Confederate line and execute this by maneuvering to the north or the right of the explosion site, and the leading regiment of the brigade on the left was to do the same but in reverse. The remaining regiments were to move as quickly as possible to the crest in front as rapidly as possible, as Burnside wrote. Then the white troops of Burnside's corps and others would soon follow. Ferrero was directed to drill his enthusiastic troops, but not veterans, for this attack. However, this is an issue that we still don't know all the details of. Were the U.S. colored troops trained? Were they not trained? Depends on who you ask. Captain Robert Beecham of the 23rd USCT recalled only one drill between June 22nd and July 29th, and that there was, as he said, nothing specific to this particular battle maneuver, but they were, as he said, most common and simple maneuvers. Others recalled specialized training, like Colonel Delavan Bates commanding the 30th U.S. Colored Troops, who remembered, time after time did my regiment go through the imaginary advance, the turn to the left, and the advance along the line of the breastworks. Every officer and every private knew his place and what he was expected to do. And so, in short, I'll say we don't know if they were trained or not. What we do know is that the Confederates figure out what's going on with the Union mining activity just 5 days after the Federals have started. This man is to, on the Confederate side, be praised for a lucky guessing. And of course, many of you in this audience, your attention to Gettysburg, know Edward Porter Alexander. He's inspecting the lines at Elliott's Salient on June 30th. He's expecting to see the siege operations of 19th century warfare to be taking place, trying to extend Union lines, get them closer to the Confederates, but he's not noticing that. He notices, however, that there's intense sharpshooting coming into this position, and he thinks seriously that the enemy isn't going to come, as he said, above ground, but they were coming underground. They were mining us, he later wrote. I always say on my tours it's important to know that this isn't Farmer Joe's son, who probably wouldn't have guessed this. Alexander is a graduate of West Point, third in his class of 38, and so he knew this sort of world of siege operations, which could include mines. Alexander reported his suspicions to headquarters. Southern countermining began in several places, but they will not, in Elliott's Salient area, go deep enough below ground to collapse the Union mine. In addition to countermining, the Confederates are going to be busy at Elliott's Salient constructing another single line of earthwork behind the position. Just because of the intense amount of sharpshooting and artillery fire, the Confederates had, who was later stated, practically honeycombed the area in between this new Cavalier Trench and the back of Elliott's Salient with bomb proofs. What they didn't know is that this will soon enough create an obstacle for the Federals. What is definitely planned beyond the Cavalier Trench is Alexander's orders to move up more artillery. And so it's going to kind of be in a horseshoe-shaped ring around this region, and the Confederates are going to have 30 cannon and 5 mortars to use against any Union infantry attack in that particular area. The plan developed by Burnside began unraveling almost as soon as Army headquarters got the plan. On July 27th, 8,000 pounds of gunpowder arrived instead of the 12,000. His Meade's engineer has decided that that's all that they need. A single fuse arrived in segments 10 to 15 feet in length, which required multiple splicing. The plans for the attack, which Burnside had proposed, were changed by General Meade. On the morning of July 28th, Meade and Burnside had a showdown about the battle plan. Meade stated at a military court of inquiry a few days after the battle that black soldiers were just too green for this attack. Later that year, Grant testified to Congress, Congressional Committee investigating the crater. General Meade said that if we put the colored troops in front, we had only that one division, and it should prove a failure if it would then be said, and very properly, that we were shoving these people ahead to get killed because we did not care anything about them. But that could not be said if we put white troops in front. Since Burnside protested this last-minute change, Meade stated he would talk with Grant about it, and it's important to understand that technically Burnside outranks Meade. It's kind of been a contentious sort of thing since Burnside had arrived back east in the spring. And so Grant outranks both of them. He can decide once he hears the plan, which he only will hear from Meade. So Meade really represents what his opinion is and gives kind of the postscript version of what Burnside feels, and Grant agrees with Meade. However, neither general bothered to inform Burnside of this until July 29th at 11 a.m. when Meade and another Union general appeared at Burnside's headquarters. Burnside still wants the plan that he had to go forth, and he is going to ask Meade, cannot this be changed? And Meade says, no, the order's final. So besides the use of the U.S. colored troops, Meade objected to the maneuvers that Burnside wished to perform. Meade simply wanted the men to go up promptly and take the crest. Problem with that not very detailed order is that it doesn't take into account the other Confederate troops that are to the north of the explosion site. And I should point out that the objective here is to take the high ground at Blandford Cemetery, which is to the north a few hundred yards of Elliott Salient. So Meade and this other Union general leave Burnside to figure out what he's going to do. Calls forth these eligible division commanders now, and they will include Orlando Wilcox in the center there, James Ledlie on the left, and Robert Potter on the right. Despite Burnside's later realization he should have probably selected Wilcox or Potter, he felt like, and they felt like, their divisions had been very used up. So he selects James Ledlie. Ledlie, as some of you know, has a fondness for alcohol, and this had been exhibited most kind of notably at the Battle of North Anna River late in May of 1864, and again in the initial attacks on Petersburg on June 17th. And during the night or the day and night of July 29th, final preparations are made that included moving 110 Federal cannon and 54 mortars across a 2-mile front to be used right after the explosion takes place, and try to, of course, pin down Confederates as the attack moves forward. White troops moved into their position, of course, now in the front. Ferrero's troops are going to be in the back of this attacking column. Colonel Pleasants will go in on July 30th, light the fuse, 3:30 in the morning, didn't go off, 4:15. 2 people volunteered to go back inside to figure out what has gone wrong. Most of the time on my tours, I don't have very many people say, that would be me. Occasionally I get it, though, and I say, you brave person. They relit the fuse, and at 4:44 a.m., the gunpowder explodes as represented in this image from Harper's Weekly. Quartermaster Sergeant James Payne of the 27th U.S. Colored Troops wrote afterwards, on Saturday morning the 30th, one of the enemy's forts in which the garrison were reposing in pleasant slumber, dreaming of no danger nor apprehending any, was blown up, destroying nearly all who were in it at the time. The hole in the Confederate line was now 170 feet long, about 30 feet deep, and about 60 feet wide. Few Confederates in the position are going to live to tell the tale. Somewhere between 278 and 350 men from South Carolina regiments in the position and 19 men in the Confederate artillery there are going to become casualties in the blast. But the battle that follows reveals more about personalities and racial divisions than about military tactics and objectives. Artillery shells belched from the Federals' 110 cannon and 54 mortars as the battle began. Ledley's division deployed somewhere around 5 a.m., supported by Robert Potter and Orlando Wilcox's men. Of course, the Confederates are going to respond. It's going to be a somewhat weak response at this particular moment from the infantry, though intense Confederate artillery fire began to develop pretty rapidly. It's particularly meddlesome to the Federals that it's coming from the right, and so part of the Army of the James is going to be deployed to try to cover and push out some North Carolinians that were to the north of the crater and silence whatever this gun battery is that's sending shells ripping through the ranks, and that's what's represented here. But I'm not going to really spend a lot of time talking about the white troops. Should have come to Kevin's talk yesterday about them. We're going to focus on the black troops. About 8 a.m., Ferrero's division is ordered to attack. The 1st Brigade in will be Joshua Siegfried, and the 1st Regiment will be Delavan Bates's 30th U.S. Colored Troops. As they crash into the Confederates, they begin to scream out, "No quarter," and remember Fort Pillow. And some of you know, but for those who don't, Fort Pillow earlier in the year, in April, Confederate troops refused to accept surrender of most of this garrison of white and black troops. And when the battle finally comes to its crazed end, we have about 150 white POWs and 58 black men. Everybody else in this garrison of 600 has been killed or mortally wounded. So it doesn't really matter that these black troops weren't there or that these white troops weren't there. This becomes a battle cry for the rest of the war with black troops. One Confederate officer screamed to his men as he saw the black column coming, "Rally, boys, rally, and drive them back. They are nothing but niggers." Immediately, somehow in the sounds of battle, this is overheard by Sergeant John Offer and a dozen other black combatants who charged the officer, and one of the soldiers thrust a bayonet into the officer's chest. Following the 30th is the 43rd USCT. Within that regiment, Captain Albert D. Wright captures the flag that you see here on the left, thanks to Kathy Wright for providing that image, and he was wounded himself. The mingling already of white and black troops in and around the crater and Southern artillery is going to start to slow progress for the 27th and 39th USCT of Siegfried's brigade. As these regiments moved through the remains of Elliott's salient, Colonel Delavan Bates was shot in the face. The bullet traveled through his cheek and exited near his left ear. Amazingly, Bates survived and returned to duty in the fall of 1864. He has a pretty impressive mustache here already. It gets bigger to cover up the, part of his face that has been partially collapsed from the bullet. He'll receive a Medal of Honor for his actions here at the crater. Sergeant Decatur Dorsey of the 39th USCT ran his regiment's flag ahead of the rest of the men and planted it on the surviving Confederate fortifications, which encouraged the men to move forward. Following on the heels of Siegfried's men was the brigade commanded by Colonel Henry G. Thomas. Thomas recalled, quote, "A deadly enfilade from 8 guns on our right and a murderous crossfire of musketry decimated us." The firepower forced Thomas to admit that his 1st regiment in, the 31st USCT, will be mowed down like grass. Thomas ordered the troops back into the area behind the crater, which means having to try to move through the masses of white troops already there, which is also honeycombed with the bomb proofs, if you remember that. His attempts to rally and charge again are going to be met with doom. You see Thomas here on the left, and Colonel John Bross, who gets himself all dandied up to go into this attack. He's got his best coat on, his best sword, best hat. He will stand on top of Confederate earthworks that are surviving, trying to encourage his men forward, and he will get shot down. Captain Robert Beecham of the 23rd wrote that his soldiers, in their attempt to charge the Confederates again, formed promptly. There was no flinching on their part. They came to the shoulder touch just like true soldiers, as ready to face the enemy and meet death on the field as the bravest and best soldiers that ever lived. But think for a moment of forming for an effective charge in that Death Valley, under a murderous fire, crowded, literally jammed in with other troops, confused and broken up as we were. Officers, of course, are going down. Confederate artillery firepower is continuing, and infantry units on the Confederate side are beginning to move up. Commanded by the only division of troops that Lee actually commands this particular day on the south side of the Appomattox River, led temporarily, turned out to be permanent, by Brigadier General William Mahone. Mahone is going to decide to move up two, initially brigades, and later a third, initially as Virginians that he had once commanded, and currently commanded by David Wisiger, a native of Petersburg, and his Georgia Brigade, now commanded by Matthew Hall, a lieutenant colonel. The Virginians, as they get onto the battlefield, or kind of moving toward the battlefield, are going to encounter Confederates who are running backwards. And one informed Mahone, "Hell is busted back there." That's T-H-A-R is how it was spelled. Another told the men, "Ah, boys, you have hot work ahead. They are niggers and show no quarter." Lieutenant Colonel William Stewart, commanding the 61st Virginia, wrote very frankly many years later, "This report from the men passing us was the first intimation that we would have to fight Negroes, and it seemed to infuse our little band with impetuous daring as it pressed forward to the fray. I never felt more like fighting in my life. Our comrades had been slaughtered in a most inhuman and brutal manner, and black slaves were trampling over their mangled and bleeding forms. Revenge must have fired every heart and strung every arm with nerves of steel for the Herculean task of blood." Mahone gives a rallying speech that amazingly isn't filled with any sort of racially charged language just before the Virginians attack at 9 a.m. Confederate officer in the 6th Virginia, the commander actually, wrote, "With fixed bayonets and a strong double quick, they sprang forward from the ravine and rushed the foe, the packed trenches." He admits that the bayonet was used in a way that he had never seen used in any other battle of the war, and this is a veteran from 1861. Virginians pay a heavy price to capture a few hundred feet of earthworks. The Georgians will follow them in, and as a Virginian who was watching recalled, they made 2 attacks and they fell like autumn leaves. The Georgians leave us some of our best accounts of their anger at the sight of armed black men, such as James Verdery of the 48th Georgia Infantry, sharing with his dear sister the day after the battle. "The prisoners came leaping over our breastworks by 50s, but our men took none, for they," he underlined this part, "were niggers, Burnside's 9th Army Corps. As fast as they came over, the bayonet was plunged through their hearts, and the muzzle of our guns was put on their temple, and their brains blown out. Others are knocked in the head with the butts of their guns. Few would succeed in getting to the rear safe." Dorsey Binion, also of the 48th Georgia, and someone who ought to know about beating black bodies since he was an overseer before the war began, told his dear sister Mary, just 11 days afterwards, "When we got to the works, it was filled with Negroes and Yanks crying out no quarter, when a hand-to-hand conflict ensued with the breach of our guns and bayonets. And you may depend on it, we did not show much quarter, but slayed them." Keep in mind, we're writing to the prim and proper Southern women, the Scarlett O'Haras of the South. They want to know what their men are doing on the battlefield. And now that they're fighting armed black men, they're providing the very details we have put down the slave insurrection out here. Alabamians finally get on the field around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's perhaps during this time that Sergeant Dorsey of the 39th realized this battle was going to end in federal disaster. He grabbed his unit's flag, ran it across the no man's land filled with Confederate artillery fire, and planted that flag on top of the Union picket line. For that, he will receive a Medal of Honor. Sanders' Alabamians attack, along with the remnants of the other Confederates on the field at that particular point. Confederates are going to eventually be launching bayoneted weapons over top of the rim of the crater. As they get very close, they put their hats on the tops of their muskets and just ease them over the rim of the crater. The Federals fire their last good volley, and this hand-to-hand conflict really gets underway, inspiring an Alabamian, William McClellan, to say that that all black soldiers, quote, would have been killed had it not been for General Mahone, who would beg our men to spare them. One soldier blatantly disobeyed Mahone, telling the Virginian that he would kill another, and he deliberately took out his pocket knife and cut one's throat. They bashed the heads of the Negroes' skulls, as a North Carolinian said, like eggshells. And when the black troops cried out that they wanted quarter, the response was no quarter this morning, no quarter now. Amazingly, people like Oliver Scott made it off the battlefield. Then only 27 years old when he left slavery and enlisted in the 30th U.S. Colored Troops, promoted to corporal. During the battle, he was wounded, tried to make that arrow there so folks all the way in the back could see. And he shot in the hip. The ball exited his butt. What's interesting to me about this photo is Scott must have obeyed the rules of whoever his owner was. There's no sign of whip marks across his back. But that desire to be free was so great that he had served. He's lucky that he manages to get off the field at all, because the bullet is only going to pass 3 inches from his spinal column. Another former slave of Maryland, George Carr, 20 years old, is going to be wounded this day. First mini ball entering his right thigh, the middle third of the leg. The second bullet entering the middle third of the inside of the leg and passed through. Free-born Charles Harris in the 31st U.S. Colored Troops, native of New York, hit by a ball in the back of the right leg, which passed through the tibia and fibula and exited that leg, but hit the left foot, causing compound fractures. As the Confederates went about killing Union troops, especially those of African descent, white Union troops realized just how angry the Southerners were. And so, as William Taylor of the 100th Pennsylvania wrote day after the battle, and as George Kilmer remembered many years after the battle, white Union troops will start killing black Union troops, as they readily admit, in an effort to preserve white people's lives. The battle finally ends about 2:30 in the afternoon. Battle's aftermath, there's going to be a court of inquiry. General Meade picks who's on the court of inquiry, and if you want to know details about it, we can discuss later. More or less the blame will be heaped up on Burnside. There's going to be some blame for James Ledlie and Edward Ferrero, who were drinking together during the battle. Ferrero is going to more or less kind of be slapped on the wrist. Ledlie goes home on a furlough, never returns. Burnside goes home on a furlough, never returns. Grant calls this the saddest affair I have ever witnessed. Federal casualties will be around 3,800, and our U.S. colored troops are going to suffer 219 killed, 957 wounded, and somewhere around 410 who are either captured or go missing. The scene here represents the flag of truce that will finally happen on August 1st. Burnside, who everyone likes to beat up as the Civil War's idiot general, calls for a flag of truce a half an hour after the battle ends on July 30th. Meade wants him to arrange a localized truce. He doesn't want to admit defeat and just write lee or Beauregard and get the wounded off the field even though it's 100+ degrees. So they lay out there July 30th and all day on July 31st, and finally they're picked up on the morning of August 1st. By that point, one of Meade's staff members admits that he couldn't tell who was naturally African or European except from the texture of their hair, apparently not accounting for those bodies out there of mixed-race black people. In the in-between of this, Henry Byrd, a native of Petersburg, wrote his fiancée that as the men cried out nearby to the Confederate line for water, the response from the Confederates was, "Bois ton sang, tenure de soif." If you're not a French student, it's drink your blood, you will have no more thirst. And they bayoneted these men who were nearby. News of the battle traveled, perhaps from our civilian perspective. Of course, we got to have an Edmund Ruffin reference. He says that black troops were charging and shrieking, "No quarter, remember Fort Pillow," and wrote about the great slaughter, but he was infuriated to learn that Mahone had stopped his men from killing black and white troops, saying Mahone could not persist in this policy, and he ordered the lives of all remaining to be spared. This is much to be regretted. Even more angry is like the female version of Edmund Ruffin, Catherine Edmonston of North Carolina, writing just 4 days after the battle. And it helps to illustrate that our perception of Southern ladies is too Scarlett O'Hara infused, I still think, and not enough of Catherine Edmonston. The Negro troops, immediately after the explosion, rushed into our line shouting, "No quarter, remember Fort Pillow," she wrote, where they were met with such determination by their old masters and granted to the full what they so earnestly clamored for, that in spite of the Yankee bayonets behind them, they turned and ran incontinently. Then she got this dubious story about somebody who was in the USCT ranks who sees his old Mississippi master. Problem is, there are no Mississippi troops here. But anyway, and wanted immediately to become his slave again. And while it's unlikely that event actually happened, Mrs. Edmonston does touch upon the truth. Few of his companions were left to tell the tale of their encounter. Northern newspapers respond, often with their biases. The New York Herald prints statements like, "Cowardice of the niggers." Within that section, the author stated that the niggers set down their weapons and refused to obey orders, and praised the white troops for being honorable and brave and courageous, and if it wasn't for the, quote, niggers, they would have won the battle. Others, amazingly, do turn to not being so critical, including, actually, General Meade, of course, Burnside, Ferrero, officers who were actually on the field, unlike Ferrero, and Garland White, a chaplain in the 28th USCT, who wrote, "None of our troops, white or colored, are responsible for the actions of the generals. I hold that there can be no higher sin in all the world than to blame innocent people for consequences for which they are not responsible. I care not who it is, whether king or subject, general or private. It makes no difference with me in a point of the position of truth." I want to get to the prisoners and leave time for questions. Federal prisoners, white and black Union troops, are going to be marched through the city of Petersburg at 8 o'clock in the morning on the day after the battle. Petersburgers turned out in their finest garments, and Lieutenant Freeman Boley remembered women in the city asking the Confederates, "Why didn't you kill all the Yankee wretches?" You know, they're being marched, two white, two black, to run out of black troops. The generals that have been captured, the highest-ranking officers at the front of this band. A 9-year-old girl at the time, recalling years later, her name was Victoria Dodson, "I remember swinging on the gate as they brought the prisoners up High Street. I hollered, 'Kill them, everyone!'" She's 9 years old, remember that. Her mother told her, "Come into this house, or they'll be killing you." Captain Beecham of the 23rd gave us a really good comment about it. "The prisoners formed in columns by fours consisting of alternate files of colored soldiers and commissioned officers, highest rank, as I said, going on down. As there were about 500 colored prisoners and about 1,100 white officers and soldiers, the greater part of the column presented a fantastic and variegated appearance that I am free to confess was amusing. Many white troops sent to prisoner of war camps, including at Andersonville, but Captain Beecham and Lieutenant Bowley, who survived their prison experiences, won't be going to the more famous places. Beecham spends 4 months in jail in Columbia, South Carolina, where he admits that they actually were decently treated in Columbia as they had not been in Petersburg. Black troops, however, won't get the same sort of treatment. And this representation of Shockoe Bottom in Richmond will be important in a moment. Interesting story I found, and we can talk more about this if you want to. John Haskell, Confederate artillerist who's out there, has his mortars launching shells during the battle, finds some black wounded troops. He told his personal slave to go get the other camp slaves and get those men to a hospital, where his body servant stands up to his owner and says, "I'd rather die than move those men." None of the other camp Negroes, as Haskell calls them, wants to move them either, so he finally gets a Southern doctor who sends them to this hospital, whereby the following day after the battle, the physician in charge, John Claiborne, finds 150 wounded black soldiers who were, as he wrote, naked with every conceivable form of wounds and mutilation. My first thought, is this Christian civilization? After threatening to send some captured Federal surgeons to Andersonville, they joined in treating the black troops, which may suggest a preview to Eric's talk in a moment about Andersonville. Among those captured is Peter Churchwell, a former slave who escaped, served in the 23rd USCT, and is captured. He's sent to Danville, where he recalled years later, "I was kept until my master, old master rather, heard I was in prison. He came there and claimed me as his slave and sold me to a slave dealer at Richmond, and he sold me to a slave dealer who took me to Wilmington, North Carolina. And he then sold me to Patrick Murphy, who took me on his farm near Raleigh." Most of our black POWs are going to be returned to slavery, including right here in the heart of Virginia's slave trading district, Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, Virginia. And where the purple arrow is marked is where one of the Petersburg region's former slaves turned soldier, Robert Banks, will go to the dealers Dickinson, Hill and Company and be kept there until the war ends. So I'll stop there, because I'm out of slides, and I'll let you ask questions. Let's start over here.
Except for my name is Jeff Smith, and I'm from Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. I'm curious, except for their last-minute interference, it seems like Meade and Grant really deferred to Burnside in the operations. After this disaster, there's 15,000 Union troops involved in this operation. Did any of this kind of land in their lap to any extent, the responsibility for deferring such an important operation to, Burnside?
Not particularly. Of course, as Meade calls the court of inquiry, he's decided who's going to be on the court. And they're all people who don't like Burnside from the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862 and the Mud March in 1863, and so they already have a negative opinion of Burnside. He's the Civil War's worst general. And Meade's recorder is one of his own inspector general from his staff, so none of them are going to say, well, Meade, you're the blame, or Grant, you're the blame. They heap the blame on Burnside, and rightfully with Ledlie and Ferrero. Yes, sir.
In the film version of the battle in the movie they made of Cold Mountain, it's depicted of all the troops, black and white, kind of pouring into the crater and being trapped there. Mm-hmm. And that's been told in other stories too. Is there any truth to that, or was that really a problem that people went into the crater and couldn't get out, or is that just a legend?
In case people didn't hear, the question is, did troops, white and black, rush through the crater into the hole itself? It is partially true. Ledley's advanced men do, as they move up, run into the crater, partly because they go in to rescue Confederate trapped folks, provide prayer and water to those who were dying. They say they couldn't ignore their rebel adversary in, of course, some of their greatest pain in the last minutes of their life. But much of the Union troops are going to be pushed, because the hole is only 170 feet long. They're going to be pushed on either side of it and somewhat beyond the hole, but not beyond that extra trench that had been created, the Cavalier Trench. So this is a moment of come to the battlefield. You'll get the sense of how that kind of happened.
I want to confirm what I thought I heard you say is toward the last part of the battle. The white Union troops saw the Confederates killing the blacks, and the white Union troops then started killing the blacks also?
You are correct. White Union troops start killing black Union troops in an effort, as they write very specifically, in an effort to preserve white men's lives.
Thank you.
Yep.
It's my understanding that originally black troops were going to lead the attack, and they were trained for it. And then either Grant or Lincoln said, no, we can't use blacks. And then troops, and then Ledley's troops were used, and they weren't trained. Was it because the time south of the line was so soon that they didn't have time, or? Yeah, I guess what I'm asking is there any way that the troops that did lead the attack into the crater could have been better trained?
The question is, could the white troops that were leading the attack eventually have been better prepared? The answer is no, because we make these last-minute changes on July 29th, and the battle is the next morning right at dawn. So there's no prep time. What's my time? Okay.
David Rosen from Alexandria, Virginia. Against the background of these circumstances and what you've described, a little bit of humaneness compels attention. I wonder if you could tell us something about Mahone.
Yes. I'm not sure all you want to know, but I'll start with a brief biography. Mahone is a native of Southampton County, Virginia, which he is kind of growing up in the era of the kind of imagery of Nat Turner's slave insurrection of 1832. Graduates from Virginia Military Institute, enlists at the beginning of the war. Not, anything superb as a brigade commander, but somehow really knows how to manage a division. And so his troops accidentally shoot James Longstreet near where Jackson's mortal wound had been. Richard Anderson's moved up to First Corps Command, Mahone's moved up to Division Command, and right after this battle, Lee praises Mahone's ability to recapture the lines, and he's promoted to Major General. So he'll remain Division Commander until the surrender.
What about his showing of humaneness?
Oh, yes. So he, several people comment on this. He, stops his soldiers from killing blacks as best as he can, and obviously he can't stop them all, even when they're right in front of him. Mahone is a slave owner. He doesn't believe in equality at the beginning of the war, or even perhaps when it ends, and yet he has this miraculous sort of desire to become a politician. He creates and sustains Virginia's first biracial political party, the Readjusters, in the post-war years, and really sort of attempts to cater to blacks, and even at one point admits that slavery was wrong and he shouldn't have owned slaves. But of course, I'm sure there are all sort of political points he's trying to reach at that point. I don't know what it all says that Mahone is trying to stop it. I mean, here we got the surgeons saying, is this Christian civilization? And I think in our own culture we're still talking about, is this Christian civilization to use drones to drop bombs and blow up civilians? I don't know, so I don't know what it says about him.
Mr. Dabney, I thought particularly poignant were your comments about the murderous nature of the racism among white Southern women. And I have long thought that Gone with the Wind is a very damaging film. I view it as a propaganda film, not necessarily all that different than the Nazi propaganda films made during that exact same era of the 30s. So my question to you is, do you agree with my assessment of Gone with the Wind, or do you disagree, and why?
Oh, brother. Or as Scarlett would say, fiddle-de-diddly-dee. Actually, there's something culturally impactful about Gone with the Wind that's still with us today. And I wouldn't go so far as to compare it to Nazi propaganda films, having watched one that was 20 minutes and took me 2 days to make it through. I can sit and watch Gone with the Wind and make all sorts of jokes as I watch it. But, I mean, it does say something about 1939, the lost causes, entrenchment to having now film production, and the hopeful perpetuation of the racial divide in the country. And, of course, it was very popular. So most people, north, south, east coast, west coast, middle of the country, liked this movie based on ticket sales and the continued popularity of Margaret Mitchell's book. One more. Oh, God. Okay, keep going. Oh, sorry. You, sir.
Question. We have this explosion that takes place, and you have the bottom of a hole and the top of the hole. What provision, if any, was made by the Union to get from the bottom of the hole to the top of the hole so you can invade the Confederate lines?
There's no provision made for the troops to get out of the crater once they're in it. And it's difficult to tell any numbers. Craters, very hard. You know, you have these lovely little battle maps here at Gettysburg that shows this regiment, this place at 10 a.m. and at 10:15, at 10:30. We don't have that with the crater. Because people are just too mingled up. All sense of cohesion of a battlefront is lost on both sides, north and south. And so it's unclear how many people are stuck in the crater. They're stuck in there well enough for one survivor to say that the men who were dead couldn't fall and the living were squirming beneath their feet and blood's running into the tops of their shoes. And so I don't know how many that is, but most people are on the outside trying to move forward. But the problem is that they didn't know that these honeycombed bomb proofs were behind Pegram's battery, nor did they know that there's a whole other line of Confederate earthworks there, or that the Confederates have just right positioned their artillery to have this enfilading fire, this crossfire, directly into what had been Elliott's salient. They thought that, you know, they all knew where all the cannon were. Logan.
Disclaimer, this may be a controversial question.
Yes.
When the black soldiers were captured and they were going to be sent to prison camps, how come Confederates didn't re-slave them since they were considered property, and there was a proclamation about a year or 2 years ago before the crater saying any black who becomes a soldier in the U.S. Army will be shot and will be killed, or I also think also re-enslave. How come that policy didn't happen in '64? Even though we had the Emancipation Proclamation, was that also a factor to it?
So most of our crater black troops are not going to POW camps. So far I've found 4 who go to Salisbury and die there. Most of them are going to be sent to Richmond and Danville, where advertisements are placed in the newspaper, come look for your runaway slaves, and of course people come and look for them and take them back into their ownership. Some people don't come looking because they don't live in Virginia. They're Maryland runaways or Delaware slaves. Of course, they're free blacks from the North who have enlisted, and so they'll be kept in these slave pens right down here in Shockoe Bottom, and they'll be there if they survive until the war ends. And some of these people rejoin their regiments, and they go from missing in action to, you know, what happened to you? And so we get the details of what happened to them. Not very great details, but at least, you know, which slave pen they may have been held in. And as far as why the Confederates don't actually implement their May 1863 law, it's the law, I think people forget this, that white officers are to be executed if they are found leading black men into combat, and blacks, when captured, which already suggests you don't really need to take them prisoner, are going to be turned over to the state authority in whichever state they've been captured in and dealt with as though they were leading a slave insurrection. It's just easier to kill them, as seen at Poison Spring, as seen at Fort Pillow, as seen for many at the Crater, as will be seen in other battles during the war. Thanks.
Al Stratton from Fredericksburg. This is a lesson learned question. During Meade's conversation with Grant, and Grant being the commanding officer at Vicksburg, and during the Vicksburg siege, there was another mine attempt there as well. Didn't succeed. In your research, is there any conversation that has been recorded where Grant reflects back to Vicksburg and said, you know, we tried it there, it didn't work, maybe we should not try it here? Just as a lessons learned, because again, one of the big things that you know, all militaries do is you capture your lessons learned, you try not to repeat mistakes.
I spoke with Terry Winchell when he was still at Vicksburg. I can't find any evidence of Grant saying anything about this Vicksburg mine that was a disaster when the Petersburg mine came around. And there's because he's not overly enthusiastic about it, I think in his back of his mind he's, nah, this might work and it might not work and whatever. But I don't get any real sense that he's really reflective about it. Yes?
You mentioned several times about the additional fortifications built behind the salient that the Union was not aware of. One of the new technologies that arrived in the Civil War was balloon observations. Were there any balloons with the Army of the Potomac they might have used to observe what was going on behind the salient?
No, there's no balloon use in 1864-65 by the Federals, or by the Confederates for that matter. Pete has a question. So Robert E. Lee, this is a question. Can we hold Robert E. Lee accountable for the killing of U.S. colored troops after they've stopped the battle? Because Lee is very near the battlefield the whole time, less than a quarter of a mile away. He's right behind the busted hole in Confederate line with General Beauregard. They come out onto the field for an unreally clear amount of time after the battle. It's my observation that Lee and Beauregard must have seen some of this killing, but I don't know. Now, what I do hold them accountable for, and Grant and Meade, is that they leave their wounded, the Federal wounded, out there on the battlefield in the 100+ degree heat, because Meade doesn't want to admit defeat. And it's preposterous to leave these people out there bleeding, crying out in agony, and by the time they've been recovered, the other comment Meade Staff Officer Theodore Lyman says is that the bodies are so black from the sun, they're bursting now, or so white because maggots are eating their flesh. All of that could have been avoided if the letter that Meade did write, he had just immediately sent it over to the Confederates. And so there's all sort of intricacies, which if you want to talk about more, we can, of where the letter is going and how we're going to arrange this flag of truce, and it takes, of course, a day and a half, almost 2 days. It's really disgusting. I always say to those people, these men are not heroes. I guess that's it. Thank you.